I've been the best ever since day one when I walked into this company, and I've been vilified and hated since that day because Paul Heyman saw something in me that nobody else wanted to admit. That's right, I'm a Paul Heyman guy.
Welcome back to Thinking Critical. This is Wes. I've got the gang back together, and why just talk about a comic book retrospective? Let's do a career retrospective. Normally it would be Eric Breed and myself, but this man's career and his legacy is so large, we had to bring in a ringer to help us talk about all the things and that Alan Moore has done. You know, you don't want to miss anything. This man has been influential, through the ages. All the things a lot of the things that we're seeing within comic books today directly come from Alan Moore and Frank Miller and some of the really fantastic, game-changing creators from like the 70s. Obviously, here to talk with me about that is my good friend, comic book writer, award-winning editor, Joe Corallo. How you doing?
I'm all right, Wes. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. Thank you for asking, Joseph. Eric Breed, the voice of the voiceless, the man of the people, the comic book hoarder himself, the man so cool they call him the Breed. How you doing, Eric?
Outstanding.
That's disappointing.
That's why I'm here.
So let's get into Alan Moore. Obviously, when you think Alan Moore, the two comic books that jump right into my mind are Saga of the Swamp Thing, Watchmen. Watchmen probably is the most influential modern comic that you can think of. But he's got a lot of history before that, Joe. He didn't just jump right into DC Comics Swamp Thing and revitalize a character, create the British Revolution, and really stand up Vertigo. He had to work a little bit to get there.
Yeah, he did a lot of stuff with 2000 AD before that, but that's where almost all of the British invasion guys came from. Was doing work with 2000 AD, and that's how you got him working with artists like Brian Boland and Dave Gibbons. They all go back to those days. And Alan also used to draw. He really wanted to do it all, and like a lot of people there, when their writing is their bigger strength, they tend to slowly over time gravitate, just like Brian Michael Bendis, same thing, settled on the writing. But Alan Moore had a pretty sick sense of humor even back then. I'm blanking on the title, but there was like that one 2000 AD book I think he did with Dave Gibbons that was sort of this like cynical cop kind of futuristic book, and it's killing me that I can't think of it off the top of my head. It's been so long since I read it, but yeah, he would do those sort of things and work on some level of deconstruction of genres, before doing anything at DC Comics.
Absolutely, and the thing that he's known for, well, he and Frank Miller really, they were doing deconstruction before deconstruction was cool. And really, when you think about, we'll get right into his work at DC, where he really, in my opinion, this is the pinnacle of Alan Moore's career, is when he gets on Swamp Thing, ends up becoming Saga of the Swamp Thing, with Stephen Bissett, who I believe was actually in art school at the time. Fantastic they were able to find an artist like this and really just redefine the character, like change the origin. And I'll be honest, Eric, I know you're not as big a fan of Swamp Thing as I am, but I remember when I finally get up to it, they finally you get the reveal of what the true origin of Swamp Thing is. It's one of the most mind-blowing things I've ever seen in my life. It's almost like watching the Matrix for the first time. What?
Well, yeah, the original Swamp Thing was just that, a guy who was, his wife, if I'm not mistaken, or no, I'm sorry, no, that's Samantha, where he was created to be basically just a muck monster, and because that was created around the same time as the Man Thing, which were both kind of borrowed heavily from a character called the Heap.
Mm-hmm.
And so it basically Moore took an idea and just completely turned it on its head and made it one for the ages. And it doesn't matter whether or not I'm a big fan of it. I mean, I'm a fan of the writing. It was incredible what he was able to do with that character, because I'm not sure that character would even have any kind of relevance to this day had it not been for that.
It's pretty crazy, Joey. So he takes this kind of monster story, and there's still all these body horror elements.
Mhm.
It's definitely still a horror comic, but it's really an exploration of humanity. What is humanity? What does it mean to be human? And can Alec Holland, since now he's realized Alec Holland doesn't exist anymore. He's a plant that has, the essence of Alec Holland. He's got some of his memories within him, and just. I don't understand how we even got there. Like, who thinks of something like that?
No, for sure, and it wasn't for lack of trying beforehand. I mean, there were some big writers like Jerry Conway, Dave McElhenney working on Swamp Thing prior to Alan taking over, but there just wasn't this strong vision for the character that someone like Alan Moore had. But this is also a lot of credit to DC at the time. Paul Levitz and Karen Berger were instrumental in bringing over people including Alan Moore. And, a lot of the credit goes to Len Wein, the creator of Swamp Thing, editing that book at first before Karen took over the book. If Len vetoed these ideas, and he had the right, he not only as the creator from a moral standing, but as the editor on the book, he could have just as easily said, no, this isn't what we want. We want to stick to the original vision. And DC could have, cut Alan's career at the knees right there. That we, it would have been like, oh, look, we brought in this guy, kind of just did the same old thing with Swamp Thing. Next, who else you got? So a lot of credit goes to the DC higher-ups at the time for cultivating an environment where something like that could happen.
Well, some characters, no matter how cool they may be, there just isn't enough meat on the bones as originally conceived to lend itself to longevity. Yeah. And Len Wein was smart enough to understand that, to give more of the creative freedom, not get in the way of that.
Yeah.
To turn something that, again, was a cool character, but in reality, just another character, into a character that would be talked about as long as there are people reading comics. His run on Swamp Thing will, stand the test of time.
Absolutely.
And we get the Keeper of the Green and all these elements that have moved into the Swamp Thing lore during Alan Moore's time. And the character's still around, still fantastic, stories created with it just because of the foundation that he reset, when he kind of reset the character. And that, of course, leads kind of like we get the British invasion coming in, obviously with Karen Berger at the helm. Vertigo kind of comes out, and you can see the fruits of that labor are coming out. And, in Image Comics, you've got Dark Horse and all these indie publishers really kind of end up taking over Vertigo's place eventually, once the terms of DC's contracts became less agreeable with creators. So there's like one bit of Alan Moore's legacy that's still out there. You're still getting like all these more cool, different takes on stories, within those publishers.
Yeah, and for years, this also allowed DC to open up a UK office where some of those people worked directly. There's a book on it that came out a few years ago, just about like the rise and fall of the DC UK office. If people are interested, if you Google that, look it up. There's interesting stories. A lot of it is kind of stuff you'd assume with an office where people like Grant Morrison are working out of, what kind of things would be happening there. But yeah, you had this stuff forming, and a lot of that was because of the success of Alan Moore. The critical acclaim of the book alone led to, multiple movies, a surprisingly long live action show in the 80s, and a cartoon in the early 90s. Like this, for a comic character like Swamp Thing, that he was somehow getting more media adaptations than, at the time, like more than like Spider-Man, more than Batman. It's crazy when you think about that.
Absolutely. That kind of bring us into the next chapter of his career. We'll skip ahead into the Watchmen era. This is kind of ends up being a kind of a big falling out between Alan Moore and DC Comics. I think they've worked together a little bit past this, but he's still to this day not exactly happy with what happens with Watchmen. He teams with Dave Gibbons, who you mentioned earlier, and Watchmen, the most influential comic book, in the industry. We're still seeing the fallout of what Watchmen was, because it redefined what a superhero could be. They weren't always morally upstanding. They could have these faults. They could be downright dirty at some places. And I think is it the Charlton characters that were originally he was supposed to use for that?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
DC would not let him use them, so he had to tweak all of them. You can kind of tell which characters those are supposed to be.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Me personally, I like Watchmen. I think it's good. The art is brilliant. It's not my favorite Alan Moore work. I'd still acknowledge the quality there. I think Swamp Thing's better, but certainly Watchmen's got the bigger legacy. And once again, it taps into that story about humanity. If you go and read Saga of the Swamp Thing before you read The Watchmen, you will definitely understand the story behind Dr. Manhattan a lot more, because I read them in reverse. And it really helped once I got into Swamp Thing to understand what he was trying to really portray with Dr. Manhattan and his journey through that story.
Yeah. And this is a book that came out about 35 years ago at this point, in or around there, 34, whatever. But you go to Amazon right now. It's the number one book in DC Comics and graphic novels, number one in mystery graphic novels, number one in media tie-in graphic novels, and is 1,535 in overall books for the entire site. This is a book that's been out for decades, just to show the longevity and the legs of that work. There were a lot of stories of, Alan would be working on, the scripts, and, there's a lot of courier services, getting pages and scripts and all that back and forth, since they didn't live terribly far from each other at the time. Just to make it all work. The last issue is famously late, but no one cares about that all these years later. It's barely ever mentioned, because the work stands for itself. And a lot of the other stuff that Alan Moore was working on in or around that time, you had The Killing Joke, you have Whatever Happened to the Man Tomorrow. That one's one of my favorites. I reread Whatever Happened to the Man Tomorrow probably a couple times a year. It's only 2 issues, but that's always something that, it's a nice reset for me, in reading comics, just to sit down with that. It's and the fact that he had requested Kurt Swan to work on that shows a level of dedication and care to DC Comics that you wish you'd see more of. There are still plenty of people that do care about that stuff, but it's nice. It for me, it makes the work just a little better.
Well, Alan Moore definitely has a reverence for the gold and silver age and the creators that worked on these books. But back to Watchmen for a second. Watchmen has 2 things going for it. It's attained almost mythical proportions now, as far as its relevance or stature in the hobby. It's one of those things that if you're a kid and you get into hard rock, you're going to get Sabbath, you're going to get Metallica, you're going to get, there's certain things that you're absolutely going to get. If you get into comics, at some point, you're going to get Watchmen, because nobody breaks into comics that hasn't heard of this. And the other thing is, it lives up to its hype. Now, it's also not my favorite Alan Moore story, but it's become, like I said, it's got a life of its own. It will be on those bestseller lists, I would say, at least for another 35 years.
Yeah.
So I said it's in. There's nothing else, and that includes Dark Knight Returns, that will be able to make that claim. I mean, it is, in terms of just, longevity, sales, you could say it's the most important work in the history of comics. That's not like I said, Action Comics #1. But as far as as the industry's progressed, there's nothing before it and nothing after it that I think that can attain the level of success that this 12-issue series did.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's absolutely mind blowing, but it's also causes this big fracture between his relationship with DC Comics eventually, because there's a clause in there that DC owns the rights to the work, but if they don't meet certain specifications, the rights go back to Alan Moore himself and Dave Gibbons. And Alan Moore feels like he's been screwed over big time by DC, I guess for 30 years, because they continuously print Watchmen, and they also keep doing sequels. We've got the movie, we've had the HBO series, and all these things, and they're all against the wishes of Alan Moore. And at this point, DC Comics isn't all that concerned about it, Joe.
No, and there's a bit of a back and forth here. There's a lot of things that could be said. All the contracts for a lot of these different things, especially like Vertigo, Piranha Press at the time, DC had a lot of imprints over the years, but a lot of them had that clause. That's why it wasn't until last year that Stuck Rubber Baby got reprinted with another publisher at First Second, because Howard Cruz's contract for Stuck Rubber Baby had the same thing. Like, as long as the book's in print and there's no gap of more than a year or 2 years or whatever the gap is there, the rights revert back. So it wasn't until, 2017, 2018 when the rights reverted back to Howard, because they weren't printing more copies of Stuck Rubber Baby. But it's hard to say that it's getting screwed intentionally there with the contract, because they're keeping it in print because it makes a ton of money.
And he's still receiving royalties.
Yeah. And whether or not he cashes the check or has, a moral high ground or whatever, he's still entitled to those paychecks. They still will get them out. But, there's beyond the fact that it would just be plain stupid to stop printing it because it's printing money. If you had told me they were losing thousands of dollars a year because no one's budging on Watchmen, that they just had to keep printing it just to keep the rights from reverting, then that's a clear-cut case of this is just pettiness to
manipulation.
Yeah, but that's not the case here. And then Len, before he had passed, had made some comments about how he felt about Alan Moore, and it was very vague. It was trying to be polite, but that notion of for someone who gains their popularity to do something like Watchmen by working on other people's characters, implying Swamp Thing, Batman, Superman, to then turn around and make those claims. And then for him, well beyond that, most of his work, it's for good or bad, is derivative. He's done a lot of stuff where he's taken fairy tales, or where he's taken, that like League of Extraordinary Gentlemen is an amalgamation of a lot of characters he does not own the rights to, and this and that. So I do think there's something to be said on all sides, that it's not really this like cut and dry, Alan Moore was screwed over, the comic industry is awful kind of thing that a lot of people, I think, get riled into.
What's also interesting, obviously we are still seeing the after effects and the legacy of deconstruction. To this day, deconstruction is probably the most favored storytelling method in comics right now. We're still seeing the after effects of like a Watchmen, but also when you look at the stories that have come out recently, I would say like within the last 5 years, that have a chance in 15 years to still be in print. Two of like maybe the 5 or 10 that you'd think of: Doomsday Clock, Jeff Johns, Gary Frakes, sequel to Watchmen; Batman 3 Jokers, Jeff Johns, Jason Fabok, essentially a sequel to The Killing Joke, where it's like an homage to Brian Boland's art and certainly Alan Moore's work. And it's more legacy. You could see the after effects and what Alan Moore still has an effect on the industry, even if he's not writing at DC Comics at this time. It's crazy. And you think about the Killing Joke, which we kind of went over. I mean, That's a definitive work. It was Elseworlds, and they had to include it in because the fans demanded it.
Yeah, it led to the best characterization of Barbara Gordon. And yeah, you said, yeah, I think if I remember correctly, Alan Moore said that he didn't mean for this to be anything more than just a self-contained story.
Yeah.
And so I said, even something like that, the reverberations have been felt through DC for the next 30-something years.
Yeah.
I said, again, the man has an incredible legacy. What he's able to do, the story Joe referenced, to Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow, arguably the greatest single Superman story ever told. He also wrote a Superman annual that's very well received. The Man Who Has Everything, I believe it was called.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah.
It's just the what he's able to do. It seems like almost effortlessly, as we'll talk about a little bit as the career goes on. It can't be understood that I can get bent out of shape because so many people that don't have Alan Moore's chops have tried to replicate what he's done.
Yes,
and I think I was deconstructed right out of comics, but that's not his fault. And he's even said, he goes, and Frank Miller said, he goes, I didn't intend for these to be templates for every writer that followed me to try to do.
Yeah.
So, I said, sometimes that you don't imitate somebody because you're going to come up short. So it just, for the sake of Alan Moore's legacy, I'm not going to, I can't blame him for what other writers have screwed up after that.
Yeah.
Because I said, he didn't. I mean, his stuff is, by and large, outstanding.
Absolutely. It still stays the test of time. And so after this, we've got another era in comic books. It's a big change. We've got the Image 7 leaving. Marvel, huge shakeup. We got Image Comics coming up. And there's a couple of issues right out the gate, Breed. The art's still fantastic. They're not meeting deadlines, but the writing quality isn't there. In comes Alan Moore. And next thing you know, he's impacting this generation of artists and going in there and writing some of their stories within the different universes, Wildstorm, whatever. And you still see his legacy there.
And unfortunately, not many people did, because by the time the writers got to Image, the bloom was pretty much off the rose as far as giant sales, because I think people, it came to the realization that there's not much there. So his run on Supreme, where he took, it said basically an angry Superman into a tribute to Mort Weisinger's version of the 50s and early 60s, didn't sell particularly well, because that, the character, I mean, like I said, all the Image titles people had kind of moved on. And, he did, and we talk about the stuff he did, like Tom Strong.
Is that his apology letter for Watchmen?
That I don't know, but
that's why I've heard it explained, was he felt so bad that people were blaming him for ruining superheroes. He's like, I love superheroes. Here's Tom Strong. This is what.
Yeah, well, he did. That kind of became his thing, where he would take characters and just, make them feel like Silver Age characters. With the stories were definitely nods and winks to the Silver Age, but with some modern sensibilities that could be enjoyed by, modern audiences. Again, I said none of this stuff sold particularly gangbusters, and it's a shame, because I said I've recommended Tom Strong to anybody that cares to listen. I said just almost all the stuff he did in that era. I think he wrote Promethea, Top 10. I mean, he was very prolific. And then the 1963 series that actually did early in Image's run, I'm not sure that even sold as well as the tiny head, big guns characters that were being done at the same time. But that doesn't diminish how good these stories were.
Yeah, it's crazy. His obviously the next chapter of his career that gets kind of big again and gets more notoriety, Joe, is the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, which you touched on earlier, where he essentially is taking literary characters out, putting them on a team, a superhero team, and put them on these really big adventures. Fantastic stuff. Like it's at least the early stuff is almost unbelievable.
Oh yeah, no, the early stuff's great. I have that, like, the oversized omnibus of all the early League of Extraordinary Gentlemen stuff, and that's great. I really like Top 10 with Gene Ha. Done that with him. Funny story too about Tom Strong. Kyle Baker did some of the art for it, and I was at a dinner where Kyle Baker's there, and he was talking about how he's like, I don't have to read all these scripts and do that. I do what I get an idea and I do what's going to be best for the story for me and all that, and we figure it out. And then someone piped in to be like, wait a second, you had to work with an Alan Moore script before. And then he went, all right, that one I read, but the other ones.
And we all know what ends up happening with the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. Once again, it's picked up for a movie, Joe, and it ends Sean Connery's career. So there's the negative about Alan Moore's, I guess, his legacy.
Well, Alan Moore, there's something about his work where Hollywood, at least until fairly recently, was obsessed with doing bad adaptations of his work, because you had League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, you had From Hell, which was, you had
Johnny Depp Jack the Ripper story. You're like, oh, this is gonna be great. Nah,
no, and that was a good era of Johnny Depp. We were not kind of over. That's before there were 4 or 5 Pirates movies, and we were all kind of But you had that V for Vendetta. I didn't think was that bad. It's been a while since I rewatched that, and I also am more forgiving of the Watchmen movie. I think there's some aspects that really work in that movie. The best part of it is the just music video in the beginning to Times They Are Changing, and then it's downhill from there. But
I watched it in Afghanistan, stuck in my tent, and I was watching. I was my mind was blown in 3 minutes. I was like, oh my goodness, this is going to be amazing. Why didn't I watch this already? And then 45 minutes later, I was sleeping. It took me 4 times before I finished the movie. It's got one of the worst scenes in movie history, the Hallelujah sexy.
Oh yeah, no, that was not great. But what gets me every time is that bit in where it's what was it? I think it's the the original Silk Spectre. I think it was, because it's all kind of in the background, and where she just yells I was a hero, god damn it, that to me, I'm like, oh, this is perfect. But after that is it. But it is one of those things where it's
faithful. It's pretty faithful, but it's so hard to visually display what Alan Moore was portraying in the comic book. You know, if you can't have the narration to go with it. So some of the time elements get a little bit confusing and muddy.
There's also an irony to the movie in that the original work, the whole bit with the Lovecraftian type monster, the whole point of that in the book was it's a metaphor for artists and writers having their work used in a way they didn't want or never intended it to, and then and then someone coming in and taking advantage of that and using it against them. So there's this weird cosmic irony to that's how he would go on to feel after Watchmen, and then changing that ending in the movie to get rid of that message is also another layer of of that metaphor come to be. It's very weird.
There are 2 things after the first part of the movie that really work in the movie, and it's the comedian and it's Rorschach.
Yeah.
Both brilliantly done. It's just, I don't know, it's just probably too long. I don't know. I don't like Zack Snyder as a director. Maybe that's probably
for
me.
I don't either, but it's
Reed, is there any other Alan Moore work we need to hit here? I'll talk about the last great work that I think he did. Okay.
Miracleman. Early 80s, Eclipse Comics. It the first 7 issues of that series, and you can tell it was in the 80s because if it were now, it would have been 6. So it would fit the trade. But it was an adaptation of an old character, Marvelman, but it was updated for today. And he did things in that series where there was, Miracle Boy, Miracle Dog. I mean, it was the Superman family, but the dog was a psycho killer. And there's an entire issue done. It's a narrative from this character who we find out on the last page. It is all done in that second that his life is flashing before his eyes, because on the last page, you see his severed head on the ground from where Miracle Dog just sliced it off. And I said, who thinks of that? As we mentioned earlier. Then there's a scene where Miracle Man's flying into the compound of the doctor, who I can't remember his name, and it shows soldiers coming out to face him, and it literally shows him flying through the soldiers. I mean, through. Mm-hmm. And you see the body. Yeah. We hadn't seen that before then. I mean, it's commonplace now. 1985, I think it was. It was just one holy bleep moment after another. And when he finally gets to the doctor, he just picks him up, takes him out into space, kisses him, and throws him back. And by the time he gets back to Earth, all that's left is the top of his skull.
Yeah, it should just be ass.
It's the grass, like tink, 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 tink. It just, it needed to be something to give that little extra kick. Yeah, there wouldn't have been, but it's just so many things. And I said, honestly, that's my favorite thing he's ever done. I wouldn't want another helping of it, but it was just so unbelievable to read at the time. And I recommend that to anybody that hasn't read that. Just go get those 7 issues. Get it in reprint form, because the print in the original comics is so tiny that I can't read it anymore without like a magnifying glass, or to take everything out and just, it's so worth it.
Absolutely. So Joe, we do, before we have to talk about some of the conflicts. He's had a legendary, I don't know, beef with Grant Morrison, I guess, about who was, more edgy. He's the snake god or whatever.
Yeah.
And I don't know, it almost feels to me, and I might be wrong on this one, that, in wrestling, sometimes the wrestler starts living the gimmick too much, and then they believe they are the gimmick. That maybe eventually Alan Moore just lived the gimmick so long that he kind of became whatever it was that he was trying to portray to the media. Is that the impression you get, or you just think he was always maybe a strange cat?
I think to an extent he was probably always a bit of a strange cat. I mean, when you look at him, if you see pictures of him, you would think his arch nemesis was Morgan Le Fay. But, he's definitely eccentric. He's definitely very, while he's not always out there speaking, when he does, he's made it very clear how he feels on, certain topics, certain issues. It's hard not to, it's a very complicated web when you're dealing with relationships between someone like, Alan Moore and Grant Morrison. I think it's easy to see, again, both sides of that, because on the one hand, there is no Alan Moore there is no Grant Morrison without Alan Moore, because Alan Moore brought that success to DC on a critical level and made it so they would go, okay, these Brits are working, let's bring some more in. Without that, you don't get Grant Morrison as we know it. But then you look at it, from, Grant, it's like, well, maybe Alan's just jealous because Grant clicked with DC in a way that Alan Moore didn't. I think
he had more longevity as far as the mainstream comics.
Absolutely. He didn't have, they didn't have the same kind of, falling out as he did with Alan. But Grant also didn't really play with creator-owned characters early on until, Vertigo happened. And, I don't know what the contracts or whatever were like on Invisibles. I don't know if they were more or less favorable than something like Watchmen, but Grant certainly skyrocketed in a way that it seemed like if you were looking at it, and compared both of their resumes, you would be like, okay, Alan on paper looks like the old school musician who never sold out, who put out like 2 legendary LPs, and that was like kind of it. And then Grant looks like the sellout who just keeps putting out these different kind of pop hits, potentially at the risk of losing that edge. So yeah, I could see where that happens. But I'd also want to add that I enjoy some of what Alan Moore's done at like Avatar Press. If people are interested in really disgusting horror, Neonomicon is an interesting choice. I have the hardcover of that, and I also have Fashion Beast, which I actually I need to go back and read it again, but it was good. It was a script that Alan Moore wrote for a movie that never got made, was shelved, and then Anthony Johnston went in and did the adaptation of the screenplay into a comic script. So you're more or less getting what Alan Moore intended there, and it's like mid '80s Alan Moore coming out, in the past like 6-7 years, and that was sort of this dark dystopian kind of take on like Beauty and the Beast. It's really interesting for people who haven't checked that out, and it does feel a little different than his later stuff because of the adaptation element to it there. But definitely, if you can track that down, check it out. It's kind of like when Def Leppard did that like album they didn't release back in like I think it was the late '80s, and then they released it like a decade or so ago, and then everyone was like, "Oh my God, Def Leppard, they've got it. They never lost it." And it was like, no, they just recorded it way back then and then held off on releasing it. It's kind of like that.
It's interesting, the man's writing career is like 50 years.
Yeah.
Not everybody gets to have a longevity like that. And I will admit his more recent League of Extraordinary Gentlemen stuff that I have read wasn't very good. But within the past 2 years, he still wrote a great comic book story. It's in the Cinema Purgatorio anthology. It was collected recently. So if you want to see something, that Alan Moore still has it, even in the 2020s, go check that one out.
Sure.
Breen, do you have a recommendation besides, was it Miracleman?
Miracleman. 1963. If you're a fan of the early days of Marvel, it is done in that style in both art and writing. And they even do the equivalent of the Stan soapbox, which I don't think it existed then, but even with like giving nicknames to all the creators, it's a great send up and homage to early Marvel. Again, I said Tom Strong's terrific tales because his wife Tesla, his daughter Johnny Thunder, I think, or Johnny Strong, or whatever it was. Great stuff. I said he has a tremendous reverence for Silver Age, and for people that find the Silver Age, boring, try this out, and you may change how you feel about it, or if nothing else, you'll at least get some really good stories. So, yeah, definitely those.
I do want to say thank you to Joe and Eric for joining me.
Yeah.
Alan Moore's got a long legacy. I know that we didn't cover everything. We might not have covered your favorite story. If we didn't, put it in the comment section. Let people know that there's some Alan Moore they might not have checked it out before that they need to go check out, because he's got a bibliography unto himself that's almost unmatched. It's crazy the amount of things that he created. So thank you all very much, and I really appreciate talking about Alan Moore. This is a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks for having us.